All right. Well, I don't think I need our in-room microphone today. Chuckles from the in-person crowd, who are the courageous few, I have to say. Thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful April 4th. The weather, I think, is probably more appropriate, as I said to someone already, for April 1st. If only it was April Fool's, it would be so appropriate to have this storm. However, it is beautiful, I have to say. Looking out from the fourth level of the McGill Library building, we have a direct line of sight to the top of a black walnut tree that is beautifully coated in ice and snow today. So for all of you at home, you're missing out on a lovely view of snow-covered McGill. So welcome, all of you who are here in the room and all of you on Zoom. I'll introduce myself. I'm Jacqueline Sundberg. I'm the outreach librarian for rare books and special collections here. And I also curate some of our collections, including the children's collection and our cookbook collection. So if you want to see me wearing a different hat, ask me a question about cookbooks and we can chat. Today we are celebrating Knitting in the Stacks. And thank you for joining us over this lunch hour event, for sharing a love of books, knitting, and design. So I hope some of you are knitting at home in the comfort of your own homes, staying cozy and warm on this snowy day if you're in the area of the snowstorm. Today we are meeting at the library's downtown campus, as I said, in the McLennan Library building. And this campus is a place of meeting and exchange, and it has long been a place of meeting and exchange, particularly for Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. And we acknowledge and thank these diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world, including myself, who is definitely a settler to Montreal. I'm originally from Alberta, and I moved here over a decade ago. And now I think I can consider myself a Montrealer. Je suis bilingue et j'aime bien le français, but I am still from afar originally. So if you want to clue me in on Quebec cultural jokes, I would welcome it because that's one part that I'm not yet fluent in. However, that's me. And presenting today with me, I have two colleagues who are sitting at the front here, and I'll introduce them both. They're giving a wave. So there's me, outreach librarian. We have Kristen Howard also presenting today, who is a historian and also our history liaison librarian here at McGill. And some of you might remember Kristen. You'll see her face and you might remember even more. If you've attended a knitting event here in the past, she created 3 patterns inspired by our library collections. And as a result, and of today's pattern, which I designed, our special collections pattern library is slowly growing. So now you have 4 options that you could choose from, including any of your own design or add your own designs to that. We encourage you to do so. And the pattern that we're adding to that today is this one, the Grammar of Ornament Gloves. I designed this one, and today you're going to hear about the source material that inspired this design, a little bit about our process, a little bit about what knitting was happening at the time when this book, which for those of you here in the room is out on display. For those of you on Zoom, you'll see photos in a moment. And you'll also hear a little bit from Veronica Bergsten. I always want to say Bengston for your last name. I apologize. Bergsten. She's also a liaison librarian for linguistics, philosophy, kinesiology, and physical education. And Veronica is also a knitter and will be sharing resources available to all through our library catalog and collections. We will have a Q&A after our presentations, so do save and share questions. If you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to comment and chat throughout the event, and we'll save up questions for the end. But feel free to let us know where you're tuning in from. If you're working on a project, you can share what you're working on as well. We're always happy to hear what people are working on. For those of you who are here, you get the pleasure of seeing the object itself. The large elephant folio version of the Grammar of Ornament is out on display, and we'll be happy to page turn and show you different plates from that after the talk. We also have a selection of books in our display case outside that show the history of color theory, some other design books, other editions of the same book, and I encourage you to take a look on your way out. So with housekeeping out of the way, you can see on screen here, we'll get to the very serious business of today's event, which is knitting patterns. And of course, the Victorian appetite for ornament and design, which inspired this knitting pattern. So after titling today's event, Knitting in the Stacks, I realized after Googling that there is in fact a knitting pattern called In the Stacks, created by a Jennifer Weissman. You can see the pattern listing on Ravelry if you're curious. And hers was inspired by the intricate ironwork that you can see and find in beautiful old libraries. And I regret that we don't actually have any ironwork in our library, but I was gratified to find, forgive the pun, ironclad proof that I am not alone in finding inspiration in library collections, spaces, architectural ornaments, and details. So as I mentioned, this is our fourth pattern. You can see the three others that we have created based on items in our collections on the screen. On the left, you can see the manuscript cowl, and this was the first one that Kristen created after consulting some selections from our medieval manuscript collection. So illuminated initials translated into a cowl. And you can, I think you did charts for every letter of the alphabet. So if you want your name on a cowl, you can make your own. The center is the second pattern that was created. This one's called the Secret Message Pillow Cover. And what Kristen very cleverly did, you can also watch events about these past patterns if you're curious. She translated a poem from our collections into Morse code, which is covered on the pillow there. And then the third on the right you see is called the Leader's Cowl. And that one was inspired by botanical specimens from a book that caught my attention on seaweed, curated by a woman in the 19th century and translated into a knit pattern for another cowl, a Mobius cowl, that both Kristen and I have made, and I do wear, and would have been a good choice for today, actually. So we have four patterns now, and I want to share some of our motives, as it's a little unexpected, perhaps, to have a knitting event in our rare books department. And some of you might wonder why we've invested the time to create these kinds of things and to do outreach and engagement with our collections in this way. So I'm just going to have a little moment to share our motives. So first, rare and special collections, like Jones's book, this monumental elephant folio that inspired this pattern, they really do belong to all of us. These are cultural heritage collections, and we are open to the public. And you can come in any day, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. and consult things in our collection. So we're happy to help you navigate that. But the reality is that a lot of people don't know that. And they think that the reading rooms like ours are really reserved for researchers or experts or students. So one of the motives is to make these more engaging, to make a creative avenue of accessing these collections open to everyone, and to do that by demonstrating one way that you could approach these collections from a creative angle. Historical primary sources can inspire, they can provide context and structure to artists and designers today. For many, it is still intimidating, though, to come to our reading rooms. So we are here for everyone, for all the curious who want to learn, to explore and enjoy. And it's really one motive of these patterns is to help break down the perception of us working away in the ivory tower in our white gloves, which, as you can see, is not true. I am not wearing the white gloves. I'm wearing blue and white fingerless gloves that are, I have to say, very practical for page turning when you're handling a rare book. So this brings me to my second motive, which is practicality. They are warm, and for those of you who are here in person, this is a chilly space. It's kept at a regular constant 18 to 19 degrees, and this room in particular is quite chilly. So when you're working for an extended period in our reading room, in my office, in these spaces, it is cold. So I wear wool head to toe, and I find that sometimes that's not enough. And I made something that keeps my wrists warm. So it's a little extra that puts it over the top, makes it a more comfortable human environment when I'm interacting with books. The other thing that's practical about them, and I had a conversation just a moment ago before we started, is that best practice for page turning for paper objects is to have the greatest tactility that you can. And that's actually available to you with nothing but your fingers. So clean hands washed with soap are the best tools for page turning for most items. That's not true across the board, but for most items, that's true. So these are practical because they keep me warm and they keep me able to safely and professionally page turn and handle documents. So 2 reasons. And third, of course, the object itself, the Grammar of Ornament, caught my interest. The book is stunning. I wanted to learn more about it. I wanted a reason to learn more about it and to inhabit it and really understand it personally in some way. So those were the motives for this particular pattern. And then let me tell you more about the book and why it caught my attention, the people that brought it to living color, and my process of translating portions of it into a wearable pattern. So first, there is the book itself. Its actual dimensions I should have measured and didn't, but this is the original edition from 1856. It's an elephant folio, so that's one of the largest books that you'll find, topped only by the Atlas elephant or the Monumenta. But this one is very large, and it's also a beautiful example of printing from the mid-1800s. This is the creator, Owen Jones. He was a Welsh-born architect and designer, and he was known primarily for two things: his drawings and studies of the Alhambra, the palace in Spain, and for this work, the Grammar of Ornament. He was also an architect who practiced. He did work on iron and glass construction in the Victorian era. He also worked on the one glass and iron construction that most people can visualize, the Crystal Palace from the Great Exhibition in 1851. It was put on to showcase the wonders of the British Empire and industry and design at the time and technological innovations. He worked on this exhibition, in fact. Particularly, the original exhibition was displayed in London. It was then moved and also displayed in Sydenham. And when that move took place, Jones was the decorator and arranger who planned out the exhibitions and arcades for each national presentation, including the top there, I believe, is the Egyptian. Actually, both. The Egyptian court is as they were called. So each nation had its own court. And Jones really got thrown into the public eye. His work got thrown into the public eye because of his work on the 1851 exhibition. It was also around this time that the ideas and plans for the Grammar of Ornament were really starting to germinate for him. His project was quite ambitious. The World's Fair showcased historical design styles from around the globe, highlighting the fact that Britain's style paled in comparison with the rich, more unified design styles from around the world. This inspired some, like Jones, to pursue an interest in creating a better, more scientific understanding of the grammar or the rules of design as seen in cultures around the world. He aimed to create, quote, a chromolithographed compendium of 19 styles of historic and world ornament that included a final 20th chapter on nature, unquote. That's from Jesperson. So that's what his book project was, in a sense. He wanted to create a reference, a visual reference, and from that also to understand the design principles that he could draw out. So he did it. Examples in this book, this is one plate. There are 100 plates in the book documenting those 19 different styles. And this particular plate you see on screen is actually the same one that's open in person. This is one of the plates that document Chinese decorative motifs and ornamental styles. The examples in his book are drawn from all over. They're drawn also from all different sources, from architectural details, from metalwork, from glasswork, from tile patterns, from textile patterns, from paintings, from architectural carved ornamentation, and from more. So they really were from all over. A portion of them were based on sketches and drawings that Jones himself did in his own travels, and a large portion were drawn from manuscripts, from medieval manuscripts, for instance, from museum collections, and from that kind of collected secondhand account that Jones had access to at the time. The book is beautifully printed in chromolithographed color, and the 100 plates in this volume are very impressive work from an assembly standpoint, from a printing standpoint, from a drawing standpoint, and from a curatorial and selection standpoint as well. He also included 37 propositions in this work that he intended to root a sort of theory of design and ornament in principles expressed in these 37 propositions. In his preface, he wrote, you see on screen, but I'll read as well, to attempt to build up theories of art or to form a style independently of the past would be an act of supreme folly, he writes in the preface. It would be at once to reject the experiences and accumulated knowledge of thousands of years. On the contrary, we should regard as our inheritance all successful labors of the past, not blindly following them, but employing them as simply as guides to find the true path. You can see he's quite an idealist. He had an ideal project for this, but he did include samples from cultures around the world. There's a section from Chinese ornament, Hindu ornament, Persian, Turkish, Byzantine, the less politically correct native tribes. And the final chapter, which is his focus in particular, is all artwork drawn from nature, directly from nature. So drawings that he did from nature. And he considers nature as the source of the highest ideals of design principles. So how was this massive book brought to being? This snippet that you see on the left is another snapshot, I think, from the Indian design plate. The question I had when I first met this book was, how is it made? Because once you start working with the world of rare books, there are many, many, to use the name of a current grant project investigating this, there are many hidden hands between the covers of every major work. So for those of you who are joining online, you might not understand the scale of the original edition that we have here. And I actually, once again, am regretting that I don't have a measuring tape and didn't measure it. But when open, it's roughly this wide, about that high. It's large. And it was not made by one man alone. So in 1834, Jones toured the Alhambra in Spain with Jules Goury. And together they made scale drawings, impressions, cast, and captured some of the beautifully ornamented details of that palace. That work was later published. But those drawings were also repurposed and published in the Grammar of Ornament. So that was one of the first collaborations that went into this book. And then there are other contributors, of course. You can see the section of the essays in brown. All of those different contributors contributed framing and contextual essays to each of the different nations that are represented in the book. Other collaborators included Matthew Digby Wyatt, another architect and scholar with whom Jones had worked on the Crystal Palace project. There are J.B. Waring, J.O. Westwood, C.J. Richardson, and James Wilde were all known experts in their fields, contributing essays about the different styles and bridging the rich visuals in the plates with the ideals and current theories of design at the time. The plates themselves are chromolithographed. And what that means, that was a printing technology at the time. Some were done only in 2 colors, like you can see on the top right of the screen. But what colors, of course, they're quite amazing. Not all of them are black and white, the 2-color images. And some in 7 to 8 colors in a single image or a single sample on the plate. The other thing that makes this much more impressive is that some pages are less complex, like the top right. Some have arranged in a grid roughly 20 different samples of ornamental motifs on a single page. And you'll see the colors on a single page are not all the same. There's a great variety of colors. And the way that chromolithography worked is that for every color, you would have a lithographic stone. So the drawing would be translated into lithographic stones, and they would go through each page would go through the press once for every color. So this page, I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at how many different colors they see, but for each plate, there would have been, if it's only 2, there would have been 2 plates, but there could have been up to 7 or 8 or even 9 plates stones for each plate. It's impressive. So in total, there are 2,320 different tiles of ornament in the book. Roughly half of the book, as I mentioned, is original, drawn from Jones's own drawings and observations on site, or from the other half is drawn from previously published works and museum content. So flipping back to this diagram, I'll point out that not all of the drawings were done by Jones himself. There's, of course, a team that makes this a reality. So he had a team of students, the Mr. Albert Warren, a Mr. Stubbs, and a Mr. Charles Aubert, who completed the drawings, for these 100 plates in the book. And then it was turned over to a Mr. Francis Bedford, who made the lithographic stones for the book. And in the end, there were more stones required than originally thought. So for the first edition that you see here, it was printed by a printer in London, Day & Sons, and it was delayed by about a year because it turned out that they needed 700 separate lithographic stones to be able to print the volume. So it took a long time, and Francis Bedford also had a team with him in translating the drawings into lithographic stones. So the first edition from 1856 was printed by Day & Sons, and we don't know how many people were involved in the printing of the book. So hence the question marks. You can know that many, many hands went into the production of this book. But it's a monument and an impressive example of Victorian era color printing, also because the registration on this book, as you'll see, maybe I'll flip to the next one, is very nearly perfect, which is something that you don't often see. Registration is the process of putting, I'll use my very low budget example, your piece of paper under the press. Now I mentioned that you have a different stone for each color. You have to get it exactly in the right place so that the color appears where it should and not where it shouldn't. And you'll see wildly different levels of quality of registration in Victorian printing. This one is impeccable. It's very, very well done. And we had it out in the reading room as we were preparing for this event. My colleague Anne-Marie and Jennifer Garland and I were just poring over it, just impressed by the quality of this book. You'll see two other examples in the reading room case out, and they're actually less fine. So you can see a difference even in different subsequent editions of this book. So this is why I love this book. It's a very impressive feat made by a team of people and brought to being by Owen Jones himself. Of course, it's more than just a book. It also has a critical lens, of course, and it's very much a product of its time. And I'm going to skip in order a little bit because that's not the right order. Here we go. If you do read through this book, we're in the process of digitizing it. Our team is working on it, but it's quite large. So we'll have the full digitized version available in probably about 2 weeks. And you can go through and read all of the contextual essays, and you'll be able to see all of the different plates as well. And thank you to Greg Houston and his team for digitizing this massive book for us. But the framing essays are very much the product of their time. They're infused with the thinking and the logic and the taste of the time period. And of course, that is sometimes problematic. One problem with the book is all these examples are taken very far from their original context. They're gathered from around the world, but also usually they identify what source the examples are taken from. For example, in the Chinese section, the ornaments numbers 1, 8 to 17, etc., are identified as coming from porcelain, being painted on porcelain. Others are identified as coming from textile patterns, others as coming from paintings. So usually you will know what the source object was, but that doesn't change the fact that it's taken very far from its original context, reframed in a perfect grid, which was very excellently executed, but very far from its original context. So that's one problem with the book. It's a compendium made by a British man at a time when it was very much a British-centric perspective. And that comes through in the essays that he wrote in the volume. For example, his essay on the Chinese decorative arts is unflattering in the extreme. And I focus on that one as I did draw my pattern inspiration primarily from the 2 plates of Chinese decorative patterns. He was likely influenced by the rather limited exchange allowed by China's isolationist politics at the time. The country was not very open to Eastern trade, and therefore, consequently, it was known partially through the objects or items or chinoiseries that came out of China. And this was a trend that was very popular in the 100 years before this book and had become less popular at the time when Jones was writing. So he does praise Chinese designers' fidelity, quotes, to the natural structure of plants and flora. And that means that they actually represented leaves the way they would be in nature. So he recognizes this as a virtue in Chinese design. He also praises their harmony and the use of color, on balancing primary colors in the foreground and colors in the background. And that is about all of the flattering things that he has to say. The rest is dismissive and sometimes downright insulting. For Jones, in the end, it is nature, not history, or any other example that should be the source of principles of good design. So the last section in his Grammar of Ornament is in fact devoted to ornaments drawn from nature. So Jones was not the only one to publish a monumental work like this. This is an example from 1869, so a decade or so after Jones's first folio or elephant folio edition was published. It's called L'Ornement polychrome, sans planche en couleur et argent, contenant environ 2000 motifs de tous les styles, etc., by Racine, a French man. And there had even been advances in color printing in those intervening 10-12 years. So his edition is beautiful, highly colored, but very much akin in spirit to Jones's work, very influenced by the layout and also the style of creating a compendium like this. So Jones was not alone in creating a book like this, and that's also why we pulled out some samples of other books from the time period. His project was very much, it was explicitly appropriative, namely that the patterns could be taken from their original context, absorbed by the reader or the viewer, and then reworked and applied to new manufacturers. The Grammar of Ornament was, as critic Sloboda puts it, essentially a portable museum. So here you see on the left an Indian plate, one of many, and on the right is a selection from the Persian plate. I included it because some of these styles are just simply so boldly geometric and graphic, and then others are much more floral in nature. Two other selections from the book, Indian number 7 on the left and a Hindu art number 2 on the right. This book is, as I said, very much a product of its time. It's a printed memento of British imperialism when it was at its height around that time of the Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibitions. The patterns and motifs are appropriated, taken from their context, reframed, and translated from their original mediums, whether it was textile, stone, etc. Today, I reframed the material again, once more. So taken what Jones originally reframed in his book, and I've translated back into a textile form, stitch by stitch, with this pattern. I recognize the aesthetic and inspirational value of Jones's book and his work, and I do respect his assertions of the fundamental design principles inspired by nature. However, I do take some issue with some of his contextual framing. I encourage you all to read it for yourselves when you have the chance, to understand not only the beauty of this book, but also its broader implications and context. So there's a brief intro to the book itself, how it came to be. And now I will introduce the pattern that I drafted on it. So this was sourced from the first plate on Chinese decoration. And there are notes that say that the patterns that I identified, these two specifically, partially responsible for the pattern that in its final form, they do say that they come from paintings originally rather than porcelain or textiles. So I isolated a few that were easier for me to reimagine in a knit form. And for some of you, maybe you have the ability to look at a multicolor image and just pick out the parts that you want. And I am not that person. So in the end, I settled on ones that were 2-color, even though I didn't necessarily respect the colors that were printed in the book. I did pull out patterns that I liked and motifs that I liked and translated them using stitch fiddle into the chart draft that you see on the left there. So that was my original draft. And then I knit it. And I brought in the other example. So this, you can pass it around if you'd like, for those here. I knit it up and I found that I had chosen a few too many patterns. And with 2,320 to choose from, it's kind of difficult to rein yourself in. But as you've seen, there's a wealth of examples to choose from. So the harder task was to limit the pattern to something that was repeatable, a motif that was knittable with 2 colors because I didn't want to throw more into the mix. And then also that was not too complex, so you could have that sweet spot between knitting something you can memorize and knitting something that still is engaging. And so there's a sweet spot there. I think I hit it partially with this pattern and partially not. But my first draft did turn out like this. And this motif was one of my favorites. It looked nice on the pattern, but I felt like there was not enough white space. So one of Jones's principles was that there should be a harmony of contrast and space between the background colors and what is in the foreground or what the motif is above it. I found that my own pattern was lacking this. So there was some elements that once they were knitted, I really liked. And I went with those and went back to the drawing board after talking also with Kristen. I sent it her way and was like, this is busy. What should we do? And in the end, I wound up cutting some. I didn't even knit them as a sample because I looked at this one, which is the green box on your screen. And for knitters, you'll notice there's some very long floats. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, according to one of my motives, which was warmth. Because if you have long floats and you carry them behind, you have a thicker knitted fabric overall. So you have 2 layers of wool around your hands all the time. But that one I found the floats were just too long. So it got cut. I revised, and we made more white space, fewer pattern elements, and simpler pattern elements that made more of a symmetrical balance on the glove. And I'm happy with how it turned out. So you can see the original sample on the left, the final one on the right. And what I have is more white space and a simpler motif of the checkerboard, which actually does come up quite often in various design styles, as I saw in this from around the world. So checkerboard is a strong pattern around the world. So there's the final pattern. We will put the link in the chat eventually. When I step away, I'll dig that up. And so for those on Zoom, you can access the pattern for free. If you're a member of Ravelry, you can access it freely there. We also can provide a direct download PDF for anyone who prefers not to use Ravelry. So that's the end of context and pattern. I'm going to invite Kristen up. She's going to tell you a little bit more about what others were knitting when Jones was making this book.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and congratulations on the pattern. It's lovely. I look forward to making my own pair. I work on the first floor of this building, so it's not quite as cold for me as it is up here. And whenever I'm in this room, I always wish I had another sweater on. So first, before I talk a little bit about what other people were knitting during the time period this book was printed, I have just a few colorwork knitting tips that I wanted to put out there. For those of you who are seasoned color knitters, you'll know this already, but for anybody who's joining us who might be new to colorwork, just kind of my most important tips. So the first is about contrast. Unless your goal is to have not strong contrast, in general, you want to choose 2 very strongly contrasting colors, like Jacqueline has chosen the white and the royal blue for her pattern. A tip that I have that I actually taught Jacqueline relatively recently is that if you're not sure if your 2 colors are going to contrast strongly enough, take a picture of the 2 skeins or balls of yarn next to each other and change it on your phone to black and white or grayscale. I one time was making something, a baby blanket for a friend, and I had this kind of custard yellow and a white, and I was sure they would look great together, and they were terrible knit up. They were just too close, but I hadn't seen that. But when you take the picture of them in grayscale, they look almost the exact same hue. So that's a really easy trick, since most of us have smartphones that can do this now, that can really help you when you are at a yarn shop trying to decide if something has strong contrast. My next tip is about length of floats. So this refers to the number of stitches that you need to hold or float a yarn that you aren't knitting with. So Jacqueline just talked about how she changed one of her design choices because the floats were going to be too long. She had too many colors or too many stitches of one color in a row. Typically, as hand knitters, we tend to most enjoy floats of 3 or less, and very few of us enjoy 5 or more. When you're especially designing your own patterns, it can feel really tempting to make something with very long floats. I did that with my manuscript cowl pattern, for example. When you're colorwork knitting and especially developing your own patterns, be sure to learn how to catch your floats. This will help make your knitting more even. It will help make it warmer, as Jacqueline pointed out. And most importantly, it will help you avoid puckering, which is very easy when you have those long floats. And finally, just a little note about color dominance. This is something that a lot of us either do intuitively or don't notice when we're knitting color work. So when we're knitting, we tend to have one dominant color and one not dominant color. And this does not necessarily refer to the darkest and lightest color or your main color and your contrast color. It's actually about where the yarn floats on the back of the work. The dominant color will always stand out more than your background color. And sometimes you can have the wrong one standing out. So for Jacqueline's pattern, I would suspect that we would mostly want to have the blue stand out rather than the white. Typically, the dominant color will strand or float below the non-dominant color. If you happen to be a colorwork knitter like I am, who knits with one color in each hand, the easy thing to remember is that you want to have the dominant color in your left hand. If you are one of those magicians who knows how to hold both colors in one hand and make it work, I haven't figured out how to do that. You just want to take a little bit of time to make sure that you're holding the dominant color below the other one. That can at first feel really confusing. There's wonderful tips and tutorials out there on the internet and on YouTube, of course, to help you learn a little bit more about that. But if you've ever knit something and then you've looked at it and you've gone, that looks kind of muddy, this pattern's not standing out, it's probably because you accidentally switched your dominant color, or perhaps between knitting sessions, you put it down and switch them back and forth. So being sure that you know which is the dominant color and holding it in the right location will really, really help. Okay, so those are just my tips. And now I'm going to put on my historian hat and talk a little bit about what was being knit at the same time as this book. So in our previous knitting sessions, Jacqueline and I have talked before about what we often see in patterns from this time period are something more like this. This is a book called The Manual of Knitting, published in 1860. And on the right here, I was looking for patterns for mittens or gloves, since that's what Jacqueline made. And we tend to see patterns like this that feel more like recipes and almost never have images. So we don't see very many images of knitting in patterns at this time. My conclusion is that this is because most people either really knew how to knit something already, they learned perhaps from a family member or a close acquaintance. They didn't need to have the kind of pictures that we really treasure in our knitting patterns today, probably because they're so easy for us to produce. However, as I was continuing to look through patterns, especially in the mid-19th century, I started seeing more and more patterns that did include images, a version of images of finished objects. So here's an example here on the left. So this is a pattern for what they called a knitted mitten and bracelet, what I would probably call lacy fingerless mitts. And this is from a popular American magazine, ladies magazine, called Godey's Lady Book, and this was published in summer 1855. So we see here that we do have an image, a drawing of what the finished object should look like. I don't knit lace very often, but when I do, I'll tell you that I really want to have an idea of what it's supposed to look like. So when it comes to lace, I think this would be very, very helpful. What I noticed is that the majority of patterns that I was finding for this time period of the 1850s, 1860s, there was a lot of lace patterns. I saw a lot of kind of basic bare bone patterns, things like basic socks, basic hats, and then a lot of things with lace. So I think that there was probably an increased interest in knitting lace or having knitting patterns for lace during the Victorian era. On the right, the other thing that I was looking for, not just knitting patterns, but was examples of knits from this time period. So what we're seeing here on the right is an example of a pair of machine knit lace fingerless mittens held at the V&A Museum. I learned that mittens were very popular at this time period as a lightweight alternative to gloves for women because it allowed their fingers to be free for embroidery, knitting, and other domestic tasks. So much like Jacqueline wants to have her fingers free to turn pages, women wanted to have their fingers free in order to complete their tasks at the time. I also learned, interestingly, I thought that at this time, older women in England favored elbow-length mitts, which is what we see here on the right. That's an elbow-length glove, whereas younger women tended to favor these slightly shorter gloves. And what was very in fashion at the time of this book were actually embroidered kid gloves. So not so much the lacy item that we see here, but this shorter style was considered more fashionable for younger women. So I found a lot of examples of lace at this time period. What I was really hoping for were examples of color work, since that's what Jacqueline made for her pattern. I was not able to find any patterns for color work gloves, but I was able to find some excellent examples of color work knit and crochet gloves in museum collections. And I chose the two that most stood out to me. So here on the left is a pair of actually Tunisian crochet gloves held at the V&A Museum. They were made in cashmere, likely between the late 18th century and the mid 19th century. I chose these because the colors really stood out to me, especially it's actually more of a mustard yellow and it coming out to more of a kind of pastel yellow. It's really quite mustard in the original color. And those pink tips on the fingers and the zigzag floral stems on the wrist really stood out to me. On the right, I don't know how this pair of gloves could not stand out to anyone between the color choices and the whimsical motifs. These are hand knit with a crochet edging. They were made in Finland circa 1875. And at the top, we see those parading roosters, which really stood out to me, and the color choice of burgundy, pink, and oranges. I also noticed that both of these pairs of gloves have those horizontal bands demarcating the space between different themes, which is the same thing that Jacqueline did in her gloves, right? Something that we see a lot in different kinds of color work patterns. So these really stood out to me. Now, in my search for color work patterns, I didn't find basically anything that I was hoping to find. I did find one thing that I'm not entirely sure if we would count it as color work or not, but I wanted to share. So this is a pattern for a colored antimacassar. Does anybody know what that is? I learned, okay, we're getting some nods. So I learned, well, I actually had read it in a novel recently. This is what you would put on the back of a chair to protect it from your, perhaps the macassar that you may have put in your hair to keep it in place. So it's the thing that, so I have a quilt over the back of my chair to make sure that, my chair stays nice and safe because it's easier to remove the quilt and clean it than to remove the chair backing and clean it. So this was a pattern for one of those items published in the 1847 Knitter's Manual titled The Knitter's Friend. And what really stood out to me here was the color scheme selected by the author. So there was no corresponding image, and I tried in vain to find something that would correspond to this. But the colors consist of 5 sets of colors of 5 shades each, with the suggestion being scarlet, blue, orange, crimson, and green as the contrasting colors, and light amber and bright orange as the main colors. So that's really quite loud, I would say, in terms of colors. And I did add, I found, so here on the left, we see an antimacassar that is clearly not knit, but it's some kind of textile. Here on the right, we see something that I tried in vain to get to the original source material and was not able to. But this was something from sometime in the 19th century, and it's in a knitting book, so I suppose that's knitting, although it doesn't clearly scream knitting to me in the way that it is rendered as drawing, but maybe it's really hard to render knitted lace and texture quite well. But this is the kind of item that we're seeing in this pattern here. So I'll just kind of give a little brief sum up of what I was able to find at this time. There is a really wonderful collection of Victorian knitting manuals available online through what's called the Knitting Reference Library. And so I was looking through those manuals to see what I could find. We have not yet decided to do some kind of an activity where we try to remake one of those patterns and see how it turns out, but it's something that we should consider in the future because I've always wanted to try that. If we did it together, we could see how different our items end up being based on our interpretation of the instructions. But we tend to see patterns written out like this, where we see all of the words. My mom prefers to knit based on words and not on charts, for example. But this is how things are written out, and we very seldom see the kind of images that we expect to see today in knitting patterns. During the 19th century, we do see an increased inclusion of renderings of knitting patterns, and perhaps that went along with an increase in printing technology, that maybe perhaps people were able to more affordably and easily include these kinds of things in pattern books. And that's how we see that increase, because I think it makes complete sense to all of us why we would want to see renderings of what we wanted to make before kind of jumping off that ledge. And again, at this time period, we're seeing, especially in the English patterns, primarily lace being knit or being offered as knitting patterns, but not finding as many examples of lace items, especially hand knit lace items. I found far more machine knit lace items than hand knit. As a historian, I thought that this might be kind of the difference between what we talk about as descriptive sources and prescriptive sources. A prescriptive source is a source that prescribes what you ought to be doing. So a manual on manners or etiquette, for example, is a prescriptive source. I think of knitting patterns as a type of prescriptive source. It's telling us what designers think we want to knit. If we were all to go onto Ravelry today, however, we might see that there are lots of things that we don't want to knit. I, for example, don't love knitting brioche, and it's been having a heyday for a number of years. It's not my favorite thing. A descriptive source is something that actually describes what's happening on the ground. So looking at my Ravelry project page and seeing all of the projects I've knit, that's descriptive. It tells you what I, as a knitter, am actually doing. I think that seeing all of these lace knitting patterns is really prescriptive, that the people who were creating these patterns for especially young women thought that they wanted to make lace. But the more well-used manuals are the ones that are telling you how to make the much more simple and much more practical baby hats, men's hats, socks, and those kinds of things. Okay, that's everything that I have prepared for today. And so now I'll pass it off to my colleague, Veronica.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Veronica Bergsten. I actually share an office with Kristen on the first floor of this library. I'm also a liaison librarian. And it's been so long since I've been up here that I forgot how cold it is. And so I'm very grateful to be wearing a hand knit today. So for my portion of today's part of this presentation is to show you where you can find resources through the McGill Library on knitting. So I'm just going to pop on over to our guide here. Oh, no.
And we'll be able to go over there.
Amazing. So Jacqueline and Kristen have created our Creative Outreach Toolkit. So this is truly a toolkit in that it has a variety of tools that are available at your disposal. So it has resources where you can find inspiration if you're creating your own patterns, under our Finding Resources tab. There are online knitting collections as well. There's also a tab on pattern creation tools if you are more into creating your own designs. And finally, a tab for event planning. So if you're planning on hosting your own knitting event, there are some resources that are there for you. But I'm going to start off today under our Finding Resources tab. So where can you find inspiration for your patterns? Or for any knitting adventure that you decide to embark on. So there's a few. You have a few options that are available at your disposal here. You can search within our print collection for creative inspiration. You can also look at open access images within the McGill digital collections, public domain databases, and you can look at library and museum collections outside of McGill. So I really want to show you how you're able to find inspiration from within the library. So I'm going to open a new tab here where we can see our library catalog. And then here we go. So I always like to joke with people, because it's true for me, and I hope it's true for you, that you go to your homepage on your browser, which is hopefully the McGill Library catalog and the McGill Library homepage, and we can look for inspiration. So we can look within our entire catalog, or if we wanted to look at what's available within the McGill archives, we can also look there as well. So I'm going to start off with showing a demo on how you can search within McGill catalog. So let's say you are looking for kitten illustrations because you're looking to design a pattern that has a cat. So if I just type in the kitten and illustration, this will take us to Sophia. So this is the library's live catalog and discovery tool that you can look within. and we can see what's available and where we're searching. So on the left-hand side here, we see that our default selection is to look within the McGill collections. And if we wanted to restrict what we're looking for in terms of formats, if we were only looking at what's available in our print collection, we do have that option here. So we could restrict to just print books. Right now it's looking everywhere. So it's looking at what's available within our collection. Electronically, it's also looking at there's a tab that says archival material as well, and so on. But if I wanted to focus on print resources, I'll just select print book if I wanted to just look at print books. And we can see where we can find these items in the library. So for example, I'm rather partial to April's Kittens because it has a very adorable cat on the front. But we can see where this is available. So we can see it's first and foremost that it's accessible. So you can consult it. We see the green arrow with the check mark, but we can also see that this is available in our rare books and special collections branch. So where you are, if you're physically here with us today, where you're currently sitting. And if this is a material you would like to consult, you can do it by consultation, as we can see here. So you can reach out to my colleagues in rare books.
It would be me.
So exactly. So it would be Jacqueline, and you would provide the information that you see here. So the Quattro 4693, and so that you can arrange an appointment to come see that. But we can also see what's available in other collections throughout McGill as well. So if you wanted to, for example, look at Beatrix Potter for inspiration here as well, you can look at the Tale of Tom Kitten, and you can view that as an ebook online. So I'll do that now. And then we can view ebook, and then we are taken to the database or to the provider where this lives, and we can read it online. So I'll pop back into our search here. So that's how you're able to search within the library's print collection. But if you wanted to look at what we have available in the archives as well for inspiration, what we can do is we can limit our search to the archival collection. And then let's say you decided to be less endearing, or you wanted to look more at cats rather than just kittens. This I think, has been one of my favorite searches so far, because you can see what's available just beyond you can look within the archive, but you can also restrict and put any filters on as well. So if we were truly only interested in images, we could go under media type and image. And so we can see here there are 10 digital objects, so 10 digital images that exist for us, and you could choose one of your picking for inspiration here. I'm rather partial to the wild cat from Turkey depiction. So these are some resources that are available to you from McGill specifically for when you're looking for inspirations. So I'm just going to pop back into our creative outreach toolkit. So if you're ever unsure how to access it as well, out of curiosity, are folks getting the slides from today?
We can send the links.
Okay, perfect, amazing. So
People want them.
amazing. So you will be getting the links to these later today. But if you're ever unsure of how to access it and you would like to try to find it yourself, if I click the subject guides tab here and I just put in so creative, I'll just put in creative. And so it's our first option here. So it takes us to our creative outreach toolkit. And then we can go back to finding resources. So that's how we can look at what's available in the print collection within McGill, but also you can search the libraries in McGill as a whole, our digital collection, through the Internet Archive. So I'll open this in yet another new tab. In my Zoom bar. There we go. There we are. So we can search here through the 19,000 items and then some that we have available through the Internet Archive for items. So the default setting is to search the metadata. And so if you wanted to, when you're doing your search, you need to search within the metadata field rather than the table of contents. And so we can still search using our cat example. This will look for other items such as like a cat, like catalog, for example. So we could put cat and illustration. And here we go. So we get a few hits. And so you can look as well using these similar techniques. You can use other keywords as well. So I'll bring up this Old Dame Trot and Her Comical Cat. So this is a book series that of a woman and her comical cat. And so we can look through here for inspiration as well for when we're for when you're going to do your knitting designs.
Real life, that book's only about 3 inches tall. Just for context, it's a chapbook.
But with the joy of the internet, we can have it more than just 3 inches,
Yeah.
3 inches. And so, but there are a wealth of other resources that I would really encourage you to explore as well. So we can look at open access images, we can look at what's available at our sister libraries and other museums across the world. Ooh, got excited and accidentally kicked the cabinet. And so here as well, so I do also want to highlight knitting collections that are available online as well. And so Kristen earlier had mentioned Victorian knitting manuals. And so we do have a link to that here on the guide as well. Ravelry has come up many a times. And so if you are an avid Ravelry user, or if you would like to start to use Ravelry, I would really encourage you to check it out. But I also wanted to highlight as well the Victoria and Albert collection, which has 1940s knitting patterns, and they also have a series of patterns and instructions that are inspired by museum collections. And so if you wanted to find similar styled fingerless gloves, you can do that as well through the links on the page. And again, I'll go through and I'll highlight a few of the patterns on there. Oh, Zoom. There we go. I will just accept. So these patterns are available for you to use, but you can download freely as a PDF as well. So we have the fatigue cap, but we also have some gloves as well for women. That's what the pattern is called. We have some great mittens here as well. Some of these are actually, I remember my mammy also had this pattern. I remember finding it at her and my Pappy's house. So it's very much a walk down memory lane using this resource. So that is available to you. And of course, we also have pattern creation tools as well. So Jacqueline earlier had mentioned using Stitch Fiddle for the creation of this pattern. So that is for the Grammar of Ornament Gloves. And so that is a resource that's available on there for you, as well as some tips and tricks as well when you're doing your pattern creations. And some free tutorials there too. So that's the guide, but if you're also looking for resources that are available within the collection, so for example, I'm not much of a pattern designer. I am very much I will actively go out and look for patterns that exist. That is the type of knitter I am. So if you also the same type of knitter, the library also has resources that are available to you as well that you can search in the catalog. And so if you're looking for books on knitting that contain knitting patterns, but also that talk about the context of knitting and social aspect, the library does have books that are available on that as well. And so I'll provide a link for this as well to the resources so that you can access these later. But we can look for these books doing what's called subject heading searching. So it allows you to search using a tag for these items in our library's collection. And so earlier, if I was looking for books that contain knitting patterns, so I know for me, off of my previous searches and preparing for today, that subject heading was knitting patterns. And so we can restrict it just to books, but if I just type in knitting patterns, I can see items that are available. So I can see break knitting patterns. There's knitting for radical self-care, a modern guide. So if you've been looking for resources, that's one. But there's also the power of knitting.
That's a good one. I read it.
Oh, I have not read it yet. But there's also what caught my eye as well was the knitting for the north. And so there's in the saltwater mittens knitting book as well. So if you are looking to expand your horizons, the library does have resources that are available.
I'm just gonna jump off just
Yeah,
because
for
we're
sure.
at time actually. So I'll slide back into frame. We can keep going. If people do have questions, sorry to cut you off, but it's super helpful. The guide we will send that link out as well. But thank you all for coming and tuning in. We have some questions from the chat, which I have in photo form on my here. So I'll try and address that. And if we have any in the room, but I just want to say a thank you. And if you need to run, it is 1 p.m. So feel free, we won't judge you. And thank you everyone for an active Zoom chat as well. And for all of the comments and kind words there as well. So I want to address a couple questions that came through the chat a little bit earlier on. One goes back actually to the Grammar of Ornament pattern, or the book actually. If we go back down to a page that shows this. The question was about the color printing process, whether colors would have been printed on top of each other or whether there would have been space, like blank space, and each color occupied its own space. And the answer is a little bit of both. Some would have been printed on top of the others. So if you can see in the center of this page, there's a motif that has blue, green, and gold. The numbers are tiny, but it's number 10. So this one here. Likely the gold, the final layer on top would have been printed directly over top of the colors underneath. That's not always the case. Sometimes there's blank spaces, but yes, sometimes the colors would have been superimposed. And that also lengthens your printing time because the ink would have to dry completely before going through the press for the next layer. So it's a very complicated process. And there also would have been a very complicated order for every page in the book. So thank you for that question, Linda. The other questions I actually can't answer. One was how many copies did they print of this original run? We come back to that. And that one I have to do more research on. I don't know. It was not that extensive because of its size, but I'd have to look into it a little bit more. One other thing for the Zoom crowd, I did put links to the place where you can find the other knitting patterns, which is under Kristen Howard's handle on Ravelry, which is the closest knit. And we can also provide direct download links to those if you're interested. So those questions did come in. Are there any questions in the room? Yes. I'll repeat for the Zoom room in a minute. Yeah.
I don't have any issues with inspiration.
Yeah.
I'm on bookstores and I get secondhand copies of Islamic art, fable art, that sort of thing. And then I transfer what I'm interested in through Stitch Fiddle into a pattern.
Yes.
I've been doing this for myself and I've had people asking for them, and I'm just curious about appropriating these patterns.
It's a great question. So for context and to repeat for the Zoom crowd, just in case I don't think it picks up very clearly from there, no shortage of inspiration. This particular person, your name is Margaret, finds inspiration in books and secondhand shops and translates that into patterns using the same thing that I did, a Stitch Fiddle, where you can even upload a photo directly. If it has high enough contrast, you can translate a photo into a pattern using Stitch Fiddle, or you can draw freehand using the computer. The question is, if you create this and share it, you're appropriating the artwork of the original creator. And it's a good question. And it's one that I thought through when I was thinking about Jones appropriating the content in this book and then myself appropriating what has once already been appropriated. The reality is this book was published in 1856. It's now public domain. So you don't have to worry about infringing on copyright for any of materials that have been published before that time. One of the things that Veronica pointed out in the guide is an open access images search space. So if you're concerned about attribution, you could go that route. You could only use things that are open access, things that are out of copyright and in the public domain. The other thing that you can do is what Kristen and I have done as well, is acknowledge your sources, acknowledge what the artwork was, who created it, and provide that context if you provide a pattern and share it. So we will eventually, once this book is digitized, I'll provide a link to the original source material in the pattern itself so people know where it comes from. It is cited, but that's the practice that we've adopted. And as librarians, we do hold copyright and public access quite dear to the heart. So we feel comfortable with that. And I feel comfortable also recommending people do that. Yes. 2 questions in the back, on the right, and then on the left. Yeah.
Are all these public access? Because I don't know if you need a McGill Library account to access the I have one, but I have a lot of them. Yeah. But I can pass this on because I don't think that.
A lot of the material that's highlighted on the guide is available beyond McGill credentials. That's available. You don't need login credentials. So most of what we've highlighted. Pardon?
Anybody on the internet.
Anybody on the internet can access it, and also our collections on the Internet Archive. It's open to anyone on the internet. That's where eventually the digitized copy of this book will live as well. So we had that in mind as we prepared our resources for today.
So that was half of my question.
Okay.
But the other was incidentally, do you know how much this book would have costed when it was initially?
Another question I should have spent more time reading about. I don't. I know it would have been highly expensive because of the nature of the printing. It was unusual to print in this way. Jones basically enforced his vision on this. Books of this scale and of this quality were often actually printed by subscription. So they got subscribers to fund the print run and by paying in advance. This was not one of those, which is unusual. I'm fairly sure, but you know what? I'll fact check, and in a week you'll get an email from me and I'll have a better answer for that. There's one more question.
This is more of an artist.
Yes, I'll do my best.
Specifically about this book. What was the influence of this book on other Victorian design, specifically because as the opening name that I'm really familiar with?
Yes.
William Morris.
Yes. So I can't speak to specifics on which designers borrowed explicitly from this. The question was, what was the influence of this book on other Victorian designers? The answer is, it is one of the seminal works. And it's something that's still consulted by artists and designers today. It's a handbook that really was very influential because it brought together so many different things and so many examples. So you could page through it and find inspiration, reference material that was appropriate for the era, appropriate for the nation of origin and the design style of origin. As to William Morris, I'm not an art historian myself. I can't speak directly to that. I don't have a concrete answer, but it was a seminal work. It made him very well known, and it has been reissued in many subsequent editions. It continues to be influential even till today. So I would be very surprised if Morris's dates are later. I'd have to double check because this was published in 1856 originally. So anything that was published in the decade, 2 decades, 3 decades afterwards would have referred quite heavily to this, especially in England and probably North America. Is there questions from online? Yeah.
Yeah, someone's Anika's asking, do you know how long it's going to be before it's done being digitized?
I gave a guesstimate of about 2 weeks. So it takes a while to process images this large, and then also it takes a while for us to get it uploaded onto the Internet Archive that Veronica demonstrated. So those links will be live eventually. In the meantime, there are digitized copies of this available through other institutions. If you're really curious, you can do a general Google search and you'll likely find either through the Internet Archive or elsewhere a digitized copy. Not necessarily this one, but you will find a copy. We have one more question here. Yes.
This is too long, you don't have to answer it, but when you were talking about the 700 stones.
Yes.
I was trying to imagine, and do you have the idea who the people, the individuals would be who created those stones? Because they would have probably pretty lowly employed.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is about specifically the lithographic stones that were used to create this work, and that scholars before me, I take no credit for this, have identified the people who made those stones. So in the center here we have Francis Bedford was the lead artist for creating those stones. The process of creating a lithographic stone is you actually draw directly on the stone, and then it's covered in a wax grease, and then acid is applied. So it actually etches in, and get into the specifics. Lauren is better at this than me, but it's hydrophilic or hydrophobic. It either repels or attracts water, so the ink will only stay in the places that are prepared to accept it by the lithographic process. So the artists, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it took them just under a year to complete the stones. And it was a group of 5 people. So we do know that. The unknown is the actual printers and printers' assistants or printers' devils and shop boys and girls, and all of those are the unknowns. Yeah. If that's it, we will wrap up. And thank you all for questions and for coming.